Hey, I'm Oliver, and I love making video games. This is the first video on this channel, marking the beginning of a series of devlogs I'll be uploading for my indie game, Sketched Out. Before we dive into the video, I want to mention that the early development footage is limited, so versions may vary between clips. So back in January, I started the second semester of school, and one of my classes required an open project. I decided to make a video game. Having made some smaller projects in the past, I figured I could finish a short game before the school year ended. Before creating anything, I had to brainstorm an idea. Eventually, I settled on the concept of the player being a drawing on a journey to experience real life. Like most projects, I began by creating a quick level and a character controller. I added some simple animations and then started on the first major system for the game. This game is a Metroidvania, and if you're familiar with Metroidvanias, like Hollow Knight, you'll notice a key aspect of the game's world. They're broken into different rooms, connected to other rooms. This design is efficient because we don't need to load extra elements into memory that aren't present in the current room. I decided to separate each room into its own Unity scene to keep things organized, but this approach introduced another problem that I would tackle later. I started working on creating doorways between rooms. To start, I just made a bright yellow rectangle with a collider. I then added a script to hold essential values, such as the scene the door should lead to, and the ID of the door in the destination room. Next, I needed to write code to store data and run essential functions for each room. I created a script called room data with an array of game objects to store all the doors in the scene, along with a variable for an optional respawn shrine. I added logic to handle different cases for entering a room. There are currently two scenarios, one where the player has health, and one where they do not. If the player has no health remaining, it checks if the current scene contains a respawn shrine. If not, the player is sent to the respawn room, a variable on the player stats script. From there, it resets the player's health to the max and sets the position of the player to the respawn shrine. However, if the player has health, it checks which door the player should enter through and sets their position accordingly. If you have some game development knowledge, you might notice a couple of problems. The first is that we don't have a way of sending data between scenes, so when the player enters a room, all data resets to default. This was the main challenge with separating each room into its own scene, and after a little research, I figured out how to do it. The second problem was that when a scene loaded, it placed the player inside the doorway, causing a loop of flipping between scenes. This was another easy bug to fix. I added a vector2 variable which holds the position the player should spawn at, to the door data component, and modified the room data to load the player at the door's spawn point. After a lot of hard work, I finally had the room system working, and I felt proud. For a long time, I relied on tutorials, and even though this was a small aspect of the game, it was one I completed on my own. With some basic systems in place, it was time for some real gameplay. I needed to create a proper health system, so I made a small block to test the player taking damage. I then began adding some AI to the block to act as a simple enemy. Since this started as a school project, I didn't want to spend too much time on a complex enemy AI, so I made a simple system where the enemy knows when to turn around and walk in the other direction. I then pasted the code for flipping the player's sprite and adjusted the variables to work for the enemy, resulting in a basic enemy to populate the game world. In the last few weeks before the project deadline, I decided to add something I had never programmed before: a boss fight. Boss fights are often the most memorable parts of games for me, so I wanted to include one. I used the state machine to manage the boss's behavior, allowing it to transition between states like walking and attacking. To make the boss more dynamic, I added some RNG to randomize its moves. After all this effort, we had a functioning, albeit basic, boss. It still has a long way to go, but I'm happy with how it turned out for my first attempt. As the deadline approached, I quickly made a dialogue system to tie things together. The system is currently being reworked and is very broken. Spoiler alert, I'll probably buy an asset for it. While I aim to stay as asset free as possible, some aspects just take too long for a solo developer to create. And that brings us to today. I have big plans and lots of ideas for this game, and I'm really excited to share my progress here on YouTube. If you're interested in this game, please subscribe and turn on notifications to stay updated. If you have any suggestions or questions, leave a comment below. I'll be reading through all of them. And with that, thank you all for watching, and I'll see you soon.